Syria is located in the Middle East, where it borders the Mediterranean Sea and in between the countries Lebanon and Turkey. The terrain is mostly semi-arid plateaus. The population of Syria is 18 million, and the family lifestyle tends to be large and extended. Some of the ethnic groups include Arab, Alawite, Kurd, and Levantine. The fertility rate is 2.2 per 1,000 women, and the education average level is 7.4 years.
Syria was part of the Ottoman Empire since 1516. Then, in 1918, British and Arab troops captured the country and eventually handed power over to the French in 1920. However, Syria gained independence in 1946. The years that followed saw a lot of instability as many different regimes sought to take power. There were military coups and other internal conflicts. This continued up until 1973 when Syria entered a war with Lebanon and Israel. More conflict came along in 2002 when the U.S. accused Syria of having weapons of mass destruction and added them to the list of axis of evil countries. Later on, the Syrian government killed and arrested peaceful protesters. There was also drought, a declining economy, and religious conflicts occurring during this time. All of these factors came together to start a civil war between the government and Syrian rebels. ISIS got involved in this conflict later on, and it escalated. Over 320,000 people have died since the start of the war, and 11 million people were displaced, creating a huge refugee crisis. Outside forces were also involved in this war, like the United States, Russia, and Iran, just to name a few.
There is a growing population of young people in Syria, while the life expectancy isn't very high. So the population pyramid exemplifies an expansive shape. This is indicative of a low-income country. The top causes of death in Syria include conflict and terror as the top cause of death, followed by ischemic heart disease, stroke, Alzheimer's disease, chronic kidney disease, and respiratory infection. East Ghouta is the main health area of concern, which is where a lot of conflicts take place. In March of 2018, 70% of supplies sent into East Ghouta were removed and sent back. The supplies were for injury and health purposes. The conflict that is taking place puts a strain on health concerns, even getting supplies to the area and collecting data. The birth rate in Syria is 20.7 births out of 1,000 women. The death rate is 4 deaths out of 1,000 people. The maternal mortality rate is 68 deaths out of 100,000 live births, and the infant mortality rate is 14.4 deaths out of 100,000 live births. The life expectancy as of 2018 is 75.2 years, with males averaging 72.8 years and females averaging 77.8 years.
Prior to the current ongoing civil wars, Syria had an improving healthcare system. There was a transition from communicable diseases to non-communicable diseases. However, there were a couple of issues with the healthcare system. There was an uneven amount of healthcare personnel, as more were concentrated in cities rather than in rural areas. This resulted in more care being provided to the well-off and limited care to the less well-off. There was also a lack of coordination between providers of different specialties, which affects the quality of care given. There was little to no transparency to the public on how these systems were operating and being funded for. With ongoing wars, many healthcare institutions are being destroyed. There has been a resurgence of communicable diseases, particularly those that involve childhood immunizations like measles. Not many trained medical professionals or community workers want to work in this area due to unsafe conditions, which results in the lack of health care provided to the public. Food and water shortages are common as there is a lack of food and clean water provided to the public, with conflict being prominent. There have been efforts to rebuild the Syrian healthcare system as the U.S. has provided aid to train and educate Syrian medical students and money for relief. However, due to Syria's decreased economic growth, there is no stable health care infrastructure. Though the help alone can be beneficial, sometimes it may not be funded continually, which is needed to recover the Syrian healthcare infrastructure. Syria is made up of an ethnically homogeneous population, where 80% of its people are Arab and close to 90% speak Syrian Arabic language. Most people identify with their religion, where most practice Islam. A majority of the population is Sunni Muslim, while minorities include Alawites, who are Shia Muslims, Christians, and Kurds, who make up indigenous populations. Syrian Muslims celebrate Islamic holidays such as Ramadan and Eid, while Syrian Christians celebrate Christian holidays like Easter and Christmas. There is a lot of religious tolerance between these religions, as there are multiple different religious institutions across the country, and it's not uncommon to see many associate with others of different religions. However, most of the wars are based on differences between Sunni and Shia Muslims. Although Alawites are the religious minority, the current Syrian leader practices this faith. Therefore, Alawites hold a higher position in society, which causes conflict between the two practicing faiths. Social classes are stratified. There's a huge distinction between the rich and poor as seen with race and dress. Light-skinned people are often given more opportunities to succeed, whereas dark-skinned people are looked down upon and are considered inferior. Those who are more wealthy wear more modernized, westernized clothing, similar to what we would wear in the U.S., and those who are less well off stick to wearing traditional clothing such as gowns and robes. Landholders, merchants, and religious teachers known as ulama have higher positions socially and politically. Therefore, they have a stronger influence on economic and political decisions. Family is a significant part of daily life. Major decisions such as marriage and visits are consulted first with family heads. Mothers are the head of the household and in many cases are restricted to the house, cooking, cleaning, and taking care of the children. Fathers are the breadwinners and provide the main source of income for the family. Children are treated with affection and are viewed as God's gifts. The more children the family has, the more that family is viewed as prosperous. The top image to the right displays a picture of a typical Syrian household. Syrian cuisine staples include fruits, vegetables, grains, and spices. Some examples of common foods include kib, which are flat, diamond-cut wheat shells filled with meat, spices, and pine nuts, and maza, which is a spread of flatbread, cheeses, salads, and olives.
Syria has a highly centralized education system with mandatory primary education that is 6 years long. Lower secondary school is not required, but at the end, those who choose to attend take a general test to qualify for upper secondary schooling and eventually university. Unfortunately, at the moment, many regions of Syria are not offering examinations and therefore upper education due to the civil war that is occurring. There are an estimated 2 million children out of school in Syria. According to the government, all Syrian schools and universities are open, but there is evidence to suggest that this does not hold true for all schools and universities. All this has caused a lot of Syrian students to seek education outside of their country. Before the civil war and the major conflicts began in Syria, they had a literacy rate of 90% for both men and women. However, the ongoing war has eroded the overall education of the population due to the lack of access of schooling.
So let's get into Syria's economic status. The most recent update in 2015 puts Syria's GDP at $50.28 billion, which is categorized under the purchasing power parity. Now, for those who don't know what the purchasing power parity is, or PPP, it is the more recent way of determining GDP based upon the power that the dollar possesses towards spending. For example, let's say me and my Syrian friend both have $10 and want to buy a cup of coffee. However, the cup of coffee in my country costs $2, while the coffee in his country costs $4. We would say that the GDP PPP for him is one half of mine. So it's simply a way to bring in effect how much you can do with the money that you have. Now, I must say that the current civil war in Syria does play an impact on the accuracy of some of these statistics, since the increased violence makes it hard to conduct research within the country. Nevertheless, as we break it down, the GDP per capita or per person is ranked 194 out of 228 countries according to the CIA's world rankings at $2,900 per year. But here's where we see the biggest impact the civil war has played on Syria's economy is the GDP growth rate at negative 36.5%. Not only is that the lowest percentage that the CIA has recorded, but in fact it is twice as low as Gaza Strip's GDP growth rate, who is the second lowest on the list. A large portion of this can be attributed to the difference in trade balance brought by the declining population and destruction caused by radical groups in the country. Now, one of the major industries that continue to rule in Syria is agricultural businesses. It actually serves as the occupation for about 1/4 of the country. Some of the main crops that are produced is wheat, cotton, tobacco, olives, and also livestock farming. Petroleum mining also serves as one of the nation's highest sources of revenue. This market still remains as the main source of export trade even through the Civil War and massive population decline. There's been a massive dropout though. In fact, since 2011, this industry has decreased 83% from nearly producing 355,000 barrels a day to roughly 33,000 barrels a day in 2014. The natural gas that is collected by the country is primarily used as a power generation to fuel the country, but also serves as a key source of trade as crude oil to increase the country's revenue. Tourism was a big industry in Syria's past, but has been considered ineffective since 2011 when the national violence started to rise.
As of 2012, Syria was committed to the Millennial Development Goals. They drafted several plans and policies that corresponded to the goals laid out in Rio during the 2012 Sustainable Development UN Conference. These plans included public transportation, improving fuel quality, planning green buildings, and eventually planning for sustainable water sources. However, the last report submitted on Syria on the UN SDG website was in 2012, and the progress regarding these plans has yet to be documented. This is most likely due to the severe ongoing conflict that is occurring in Syria.